appreciate you all being here. My name is Timea Tihanyi. I am based in Seattle. I teach at the University of Washington, and then I run my own studio called Sleep Rabbit that is dedicated to be like a mentoring space and a research space in this area of ceramic 3D printing. My background is in ceramics. My BFA and my MFA are all in ceramics. Before getting into printing, I was doing hand building, and then I was doing for over 10 years, I was doing a lot of slip casting, and then about 8 years ago, when this field of ceramic 3D printing was kind of starting to like become available, that's when I entered the playfield and set up the studio. And from the beginning, I figured I know nothing about this, but I will figure it out, and I will figure it out with the collaboration of others. And I think this is, I'm going to show mostly the things that I make as my artwork, and very less of what the studio makes, which is a lot of like searching. But the relationship between what I do as Timea Tihanyi and then what the studio does is that a lot of the projects are starting up as kind of like weird research areas in something, or let's figure this out. And then once there is kind of like a pathway to it, I usually take it to serve whatever artistic purposes I have. So I set up this presentation to talk about the then and the now, and I have to admit that this presentation is, I'm recycling it from last year, but I added new slides to it. So when I was looking at it, the now actually seemed to be then. Does it make sense, right? So it's like we moved so far, so fast, that even what is still, I feels like the current work, it's also in the past because I moved on. So I will finish by showing some and then telling you about the work that I'm here to do, and then just explain about it, like why I'm interested in it. But I feel like it's very necessary to look back and look at kind of like the come on in, then the recent past, and then some older past. So maybe before I even talk about ceramics, there are couple of other biographical things that you might be interested in knowing. So I was born and grew up in Hungary, in Central Europe, during the old communist era, and I was in college in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, and a couple of years later I finished, so I was in medical school, I finished medical school, I got my degree, I got my certificates and everything, and I came to the States to do neuroscience research. And that's when I kind of found ceramics pretty much the same way as some of you are here, found the studio, it became a community, it became the place where I really wanted to spend the time, and I felt like I could express myself, I can talk about things through the work. And then I said that I'm just going to try ceramics for a little while, and I can return to research. And then that has never happened until now, but I'm not saying it won't ever happen. So my work is always interested in two things. One is kind of the physicality of the body, and then kind of the bodily existence of the body, and then the other was the mind and body relationship, but not in kind of like a new age way, mind and body, but what are those things that we are able to access through our bodies, and what are those things that are maybe more projectable into some future or towards some solution only through logic. I am married to a mathematician, and he's a research mathematician. So what he does is in this kind of like very far removed levels of abstraction where there is nothing tangible about it, you can't imagine it, you just have to follow some pathway of logic. So the then piece that's on the screen is what I made at the Kohler factory. And it's it makes me cry to look at the day 2011. Oh my goodness, right? That was so long ago, but I was still slip casting at the time. And what I was doing was at the factory, I went there, and it was a tumultuous year. A lot of people were fired at that time. The economy was so bad. There was all kinds of social strife and everything in the culture. And at the factory, people were being fired. And then if you ever lived in that kind of small town community, everybody's livelihood was dependent on the breadwinner, mostly the father in the family who worked for the factory, and that their income and their benefits provided for the entire family. So it was a huge disaster. And what happened at Kohler, that the molds were thrown away after the casting, because these plaster molds just kind of wear down and they become not as useful. It takes very long to fix the print that comes out of it, and they break them. And I took the molds and made molds of the molds so I can recreate them, and I reproduced them in the Kohler ceramics. So that's what I was doing then. And then now I'm still interested in the sense of sort of touch and tactility, and kind of things that are sort of talking about about being in the world, about being in a world as part of a cultural, social, and kind of physical construct. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more. But I wanted to show you a little bit more of the then and the now. So about, 8 years ago, I was doing a series of installations. They were called Parlor Games, and each had a different name, but they were kind of thinking about what science means in our culture, or how scientific knowledge kind of influences our culture. And in this installation, and that's what I was fearing, that the screen is a little bit too bright, so it's all the lights are blown out, so you can't really see much of the details. Or maybe if you can imagine with me. So there is a library of 155 books in this installation, and the books were slip cast at the European Ceramic Art Center. So they are all bone china. They are this almost transparent, almost glassy white. And there is a title on each book. And the titles are, some of them are actual books, and others are completely made up titles that are scrambled together from books that are on my bookshelf. And they seem to be super meaningful. And at that time, I was also making contact there with various communities. One of them was a guild of archers, and they were preserving this Catholic tradition in a Protestant land that had to do with mastery of archery. And I was very interested in how they were mastering their bodies in order to shoot these really high up targets. And so I was hanging out with them, made a whole bunch of videos. So in this installation, there are videos, there are books, there are all kinds of things. And then now I don't make as many installations these days, but I do work with sculptures. They're still influenced by kind of cultural codes. And this is about a theater play that is Hungarian and very uniquely recognized in the culture. And I will have this slide coming back later to tell you more about that. So in my studio, I have two kinds of 3D printers. I wanted to show you that because it sort of signals a change of me starting to 3D print. So I have, and this picture is the older version of the PotterBot, which when we do the walkthrough, you're going to see in these spaces, and it will be available to you when they're super easy to use. That was my first printer. And then my second printer, a couple of years later, is this WASP floor model that prints up to about this height, and then it's a pretty nimble thing. So I'm gonna run this video. It has a little sound, but I can kind of like talk over it. This is kind of a participatory performance piece. I also call it a techno-haptic project, so it has to do with technology and touch. And we do this in my studio from time to time, where like when I go do a workshop, I would start out with one of these. And the idea here is that you don't print on a platform, you print in your hand. And you print in your hand because the shape that you are making is a sphere that otherwise you wouldn't be able to print, because if you were to put a sphere down on a flat surface, it is only in a point that it meets the surface. So it's not something that can be actually built. So you're using the hand to make it, and I sort of came up with the idea of this performance after getting a bunch of pushback from the ceramics community, because everybody was saying like, oh, now you print, so you don't use your hands. It's not about the hand anymore. And I was gonna say like, yes, it is about the hand. If the hand is important to you, if that's why you are in ceramics, then is that this machine is not gonna take it out any more than the potter's wheel will take it out, or the molds will take it out. You can work with the machine. And a lot of the things that I'm interested in doing is trying to find ways of working with technology so that it becomes very human oriented, right? So you're kind of like using it as a piece, even though there are algorithms behind some of the things, and there are things that maybe like, oh, I know nothing about it. I don't know how the TV works either, or how the microwave works, right? And we use it. So it's not a big deal, right? And then once you get over that fact of like, oh, I don't know, then we can start knowing. And as like Joey can attest, we kind of broke a printer during my being here, and then we fixed the printer, and it's fine. It's all fine. It's not anything harder to do than when like your door jams or something. Okay, so I'm gonna stop this and then just move on to showing more work. So I'm gonna show you a body of work here that I really loved, and this body of work started with an invitation to the Glass Museum that is in Tacoma, so it's kind of the West Coast version of Corning. And they invited me for a week of residency, and I had a bunch of ideas for combining glass and ceramics. And I'm building these bulbous kind of vessel forms on the 3D printer, but I'm also making molds of them. And the mold, how many people do need a little explanation of what a mold is? Doesn't seem like it. Perfect, right? So the mold is for getting this kind of like shape. Again, but it's you can blow glass into it, so it's covered with graphite. The gaffers will bring the bubble, and then we'll blow into it. So it's the exact same shape when it starts out as the ceramic piece is. And then what I was doing then is that I wanted to kind of like bring the two materials together. And this was maybe on the 4th day of the residency, after so many failures and so many broken pieces, because at first I wanted to like physically like meld the materials together, and of course they have different expansion rates, so they're just going to crack. And there was a bunch of pieces shattered, and I was like, fine, let's use the molds, let's do them this way. And once I started seeing the results, again, like my mind is always going so many ways. So on one hand, I'm thinking about like how something can be done, or like what's interesting about that material's transformation. On the other hand, I'm always thinking about what it means to see these forms emerging. And as soon as I saw this form, it's like, oh my God, this is my relationship with my mother, right? This is some sort of like a filial relationship when the two are of the same, but they kind of like being shaped by different forces. There are different materials, and they're being held together, like kind of like tied together, for better or worse, right? They kind of like having to be supporting one another, having to balance one another. Like it's a, you know, it's a very tedious, tenuous relationship. So then I made several forms, and you see a lot in my work, especially my older work, that things are just barely balancing on one another. The curators hate it, the galleries hate it, because everything is just so dangerously together. There's a lot of things, so at that time I started working with these acrylic panels, and I love the way they color the otherwise monochromatic material. I love working with porcelain. That won't ever change, I think. I love the natural color of it. Don't really glaze. Just use color in just spots like the quartz here. But the glass actually does give it an illusion of the color. It also creates reflections and things like that. So I'm going to change the subject a little bit and talk about patterns and algorithms, because this also leads to a more recent body of work. And also this is very much of like how my mind works. I'm like having my hand in a zillion things, and then whatever resonates in the moment, that's the one that I'm writing. But this is a body of work that I was able to make with the help of a mathematician from University of Washington, Sarah Billy, and then Sarah's student Daria, who was a very wonderful collaborator, and then we have developed a lot of this work. But basically, this work started out, so this work means the pattern, the work with the patterns, started out because I was already experimenting in 3D printing, recognized that one of the unique features of 3D printing that you can get these patterns. And at the time in 2017, early 2018, I started talking about them as very textile-like, very much weaving patterns, knitting patterns, and a lot of the studio's work was about how to develop these vocabulary of patterns. But my own work was on a different ground. I was asking these mathematicians if there was a mathematical way of describing chaos. And so, if everything is logic and everything is structured, is chaos? Does chaos have that kind of structure behind it? And they were like, oh, you know, like it's very hard to generate random numbers, and you know, like all of these things. So basically, it kind of sounded like a no. But they were saying like, oh, I think what you're talking about is a phenomena called the elementary cellular automata. And the elementary cellular automata, I don't want to go into the depths of it in this talk, but it's a very simple system of just a few rules, right? So if you do this, then that's what happened. There are basically 3 rules, okay? And those 3 rules create an immense amount of variety. And then that work with the cellular automata led me to this kind of work with the cross-stitching, but let me just go talk about the cellular automata. So the way you imagine it is that you plant this seed that's on this very top, right? And then the seed is a generation, as like the moms and dads. And then in the next layer, so then you apply the rules, and then in the next layer, the children's generation is going to be whatever the rules are going to dictate. And then the grandchildren's generation is just going to be the same rules, but it's even more diverse. And then another generation is going to be even more diverse. And in sometimes you actually, when you look at these generations, you're going to start seeing patterns, and it's very regular. And other times you're just not going to see patterns, it's just going to be a complete chaos. And then the work that we were doing with Daria, I don't know if you remember that we actually planted these viruses that were actually like seeds, rules that just totally broke the system and kind of unraveled. And what we noticed is that at some point the system kind of stabilized and it started generating these regular patterns again. So it's extremely hard to get chaos, which is Now if you think about 3D printing and working on these digital ways, right, we're getting a lot of regularity, and it does need that human hand to actually break that. But, there. So it's a little bit of a then and a now in the span of 2 years. So on the left, I'm doing this mathematical work that you see on the wall. It's hand-cut vinyl, about 10 feet high. It's about the size of this room, but twice as tall. This entire wall has this automata pattern, and so do the porcelain vessels. So I was doing that for maybe 2 years. And started thinking about how in weaving and knitting, individual makers would innovate within the confines of the technique and also the confine of the tradition. So for example, if somebody is a weaver, they learn a pattern library, right? So you do 2 under, 2 over, 2 under, 2 over, then you slide it over, and that will give you a twill. But then they also innovate by changing that. And I wanted to know where that kind of preserving of the tradition, preserving of the rules, or breaking of the rules comes from. And so I was doing patterns that were kind of from embroidery on these vessels, but I layered them digitally and they become completely different from the original. But then one of the other things I wanted to say quickly is that pretty soon I was very bored of the straight up cylinder, and I started hand manipulating the form. So this was still 3D printed, just like the ones in the background, but they're kind of squished together, and also in the kiln I'm using forces, I can tell you later about, that are shaping it even more. But I don't know, maybe this was a mistake if you're not into this kind of math and art, but I wanted to spend just one more minute to explain, because it's so much part of what happens in the studio and also in my mind. So I have collaborated with many mathematicians since these early days, and there is a software that allows us to make the forms. And this day and age, that software, you can physically manipulate physical blocks in the software, but you can also basically just put mathematical formulas into the software. This is kind of a brief way of explaining. And we are using what's called in math the Fourier series to mimic knitting patterns. And what I wanted to show you mostly is that here's the same kind of form coming out of the digital space. And it's very much dependent on the tool what that end product is going to look like. So this is the same file printed in a 4-inch diameter in the PLA printer. So this is the plastic printer. It's a more fine sort of seeing of the details. But it's also the physicality of that material is completely different from clay. This other one on the left is in porcelain. It is 25 inches diameter, right? And then you notice that all those loops are kind of closing down. So clay is behaving extremely different from the plastic. And I really love that about clay printing. Another series of collaborations that I do is with designers. My kind of returning collaboration partner is Audrey Desjardins, who's an interaction designer. And we have collaborated on 2 projects, and they all had to do with inputting data onto physical objects. So in this case, it's cups. And the data is sound information. So we were kind of taking sound information from the environment and processing it with the form file. And actually, I just realized you helped me with the actual coding of this once we have taken this to another level. So Daria was very much involved with a later step of this. But the early iteration of this project really happened because on my printer, I recognized that there was a moment when the printer stopped and it was still passively extruding material. So when we were kind of like brainstorming about how to represent this data, I said, like, I've seen a lot of people doing like all kinds of intentional patterns. Why don't we use this feature of the printer stopping? And then that will produce, by extension, the representation of the data. The longer the printer is stopping, the bigger that kind of blob gets. So then the sound information was coded to the duration of the stop, and then it made the printer stall, and that is, otherwise the form is like a completely smooth cup form, but it kind of like dots that. Does that make sense? Okay, great. You guys are awesome. So, and then a more recent collaboration, we are using vibrations. And this is kind of like a whimsical collaboration in which there is this device in the home that is like, as all of our devices, always listening, right? Always listening, always collecting information about you, always, you never really know what it, like how it's handling that information, what it's retaining. And we wanted to make kind of like fun of that. So design this, this is a slip cast ceramic form, porcelain form. There is a recording device in there, and the recording device is going to take vibrations from the environment. So we'll take the sound waves, but there's everything else, like things bouncing, or like the train going by, and machines going off in your environment. It's going to do all that. You intentionally turn it on and off. It will do a recording. We'll take that recording, and then we'll put it on these, where's my cursor? On here, on these rings, and those represent the vibration environment in your home. So I did a whole design research on this. This has taken us 2 years to develop that, and then they were implementing it, but I had nothing to do with the implementation. Okay, so then back to that. Now that you know how my mind works, just back to the work a little bit. So that then, again, had to do with the early days of the studio when we were trying to figure out like how to create textures, how to sequence those loops. And then now is about all those kind of like embroidery patterns. I wanted to show you, this is the design environment. So this is Rhino, the CAD environment. Not the only one, there are much simpler ones, but this is the one that I love the most. And if you are familiar with Photoshop, this may be familiar to you. In Rhino you have layers, and then you can put information on layers and then read them separately or read them all together. So the way my patterns come together is that I will pick up a tiny fraction of a pattern from an embroidery pattern. Something like, it's hard to say in here, but something like this cross. And I will put it in many layers, and I sequence it and pattern it even more, and then I will do these alterations in all of these layers, and then when I turn them on, I see a whole new pattern. It's a little bit like reading shapes into clouds, or into the stars or whatnot. It's a whole lot like that. But what I'm intrigued by is that you basically throw this thing out completely random, and somehow it just starts making sense. And I think, like, I don't really believe in bigger forces, though there may be. But I do believe, and I know for a fact, that our minds are sense-making machines, right? Our minds are geared so that we are trying to interpret everything, try to make sense of it, try to create a story of it. We see these animals in the clouds, and we see these patterns. And this is what the work is about. This is the same set of basic patterns, and I manipulate them in the layers, and they come out every time completely different. And so I have this series of vessels. And then so it kept me busy for about a year and a half to make a whole bunch of patterns and like have these varieties. One more thing maybe if I should mention, these are 2 millimeter thickness when it's being printed and about this tall. So they're just to figure out on my printer that has a moving platform how to make them survive, and they are in porcelain. How to make them survive, that was no small, thing. It was not a small thing. So I don't like thick things. I don't like non-porcelain things. It's okay, I'm just saying, because you're gonna see some things in the future. So then I got bored with the cylinder. I still made them because one of the amazing things about the digital, once you have the file, which might take you a whole week to develop, you can endlessly iterate it for years, right? You can just produce it and make it smaller, make it bigger, make it stretch that, make it this, make it that. It's all gonna be different. You're gonna see it in the studio. It's not, you don't have to make a new file every single time. So I started squishing them together. And every good idea I have just basically kind of like happens because of an accident. And then you observe that accident and you say like, okay, maybe this is cool. How can I recreate this, right? So one of the pieces fell on the printer, it kind of fell together. Okay, this was cool, what can I do with that? Then I started experimenting by making that collapse intentional and then also collapsing them onto one another. I can tell you more about the techniques, but there are several ways that I have developed, but basically just kind of mushing them together in very physical ways. Okay, so here's some kind of like presentation. So I had a show at the Bellevue Art Museum. We actually collaborated with another artist, Sylvia Tur, and she's a slipcaster, and this was at the tail ends of the pandemic. The museum just reopened. I mean, we had the show scheduled for 4 years at that time, and it was just kind of like bummed because of the pandemic. And we kind of had to scrape all the ideas that we had for the show, because like what's relevant, and starting to prepare for it. It opened in January 1st in 2022, and it's like what's relevant to make in 2021, right? And everybody was still in the pandemic. We were in Zoom windows. We were like thinking about our own lives, but it's like everybody seemed so remote. So we decided to basically just kind of like, and we are both immigrants from former Eastern Europe. So we decided to talk about this kind of like immigrant experience of being able to bring only certain things, how you narrate your own kind of family history, your cultural history through these objects that you are bringing, that you're keeping, that you're collecting in your new environment. How do you make yourself a home? How do you feel at home? And then so all of these little windows in my mind, I mean, these are Zoom windows, these are apartment windows, these are shipping crates, these are little like vitrines. These are all little views into kind of like my life. And I'm not embarrassed to say all the work that I do is about me all the time, like my experience, my life, my whatever. So this figurine was gifted to me by my grandmother when I was a child. It was left in the vitrine of my mom when I left Hungary. And in 2021, I asked my mom, who started having memory issues, I asked my mom to send it to me. And she packaged it beautifully and made it to me. And I didn't know why I wanted, I just wanted to have it. It's also important to note that this is a porcelain figurine, a very Victorian lady. When I was a kid, this whole skirt was down to the ankles, and it was made of this porcelain lace. And as a kid, this was the most wondrous thing to me, because on one hand, you see that it's porcelain, it's not fabric. On the other hand, it is the lace, right? So when it's like, what is this thing? Like, how do people make this thing? And when I started doing ceramics, I was very interested in these kinds of things. So what happened is the piece arrived, I was holding on to it a bit, and I was getting ready for the museum show, and I was like, I have to break it. I have to break it. I wasn't sure why, but I knew that I had to. And so I worked with this production company who had this super slow motion camera that the movie industry uses, and we broke it. And we did the recording of it. And before it got broken, I scanned it so that I can 3D print it again. And as I did that, everything started congealing together. And it's called object permanence. It's about holding on to things, but it's also about loss. It's about like what a thing is in your relationship to that thing. And what I would like to claim is that this object both exists and it doesn't exist, right? And it's partially thanks to the digital, because the actual object doesn't exist anymore. But you've seen it breaking, you know that it's gone. There is a presence to it. The form is still available. I can reproduce, and I have reproduced the form. There are lots of layers of this, and I think these layers are the ones we're kind of like, or at least I am. I know I'm sort of like struggling with in my understanding of the human like being or existence. So in the recent exhibitions, for some reason, I feel like I'm very compelled to have this video, and then you're going to see some of the pieces from the museum show, kind of like being recycled in these two new shows. The one is called To Go Gentle, and it really is both the poem To Go Gentle into the Night, which is about passing, but it's also about how around this like very thin porcelain you're just compelled to go gentle, because you feel like, I mean, the sense of like loss and breakage is like super important about it. And then and my show last summer was called Tender, because of this piece on the left, and they just kind of like using these pieces as singles. And you see again that I'm like putting a lot of things on the line. Like these are physically, like the hand is just attached at the fingertip to that porcelain form. And you see a bunch of hands in this show. And you might ask, like, why do you have to have the hand in there? And then those are the things again, like, I don't know, I mean, it's about tactility, but the hands were based on gestures that I remember my family members making, like we all kind of like culturally make them, you know. In Hungary we have this kind of like I don't know, we are very like gestury with our hands. But it's actually, there was actually a stage play that is very famous, and I don't want to go into the details, but it was recorded in the 50s as a movie. It's black and white, and then the actual hand positions I'm copying from that movie. So I'm gesturing this. I'm watching the movie, holding my hands the same way, scanning my hand, right? So then I have the form of that gesture, and I'm 3D printing the hand. And then I make a whole bunch of these cylinders, squish them together. It's not as easy as I make it sound, and I plant the hand in there, and then everything just gets like cinched together in the final firing. So these pieces go through about 5 firings or so, and there are quite a lot was happening to them. In that same show, there was this piece that I really liked. It was kind of a different from all the other pieces, but I was again thinking a lot about these kind of like cultural histories, and we do have what do you call them, what you use for the prom? I always forget the corsage. So we kind of like used corsages in other contexts too, and they have a different name for that. So these flowers are kind of like, they are very large. They're kind of like 4 feet diameter individually, and they're high up on the wall. And they kind of reference to that. And then here is just sort of that I can maybe, again, just explain about the hand, though I think I made it clear that they were from the stage play that was recorded into the movie, and these are really gestures that anybody would recognize. They don't have very specific meanings, but you just see my people doing them all the time. Okay, so then I want to shift gears to this last project. This was during the pandemic, but I started having the idea of I made enough of these, right? And we always form them from, we always form ceramic from both the inside and the outside. If you were throwing on the wheel, you know what I'm talking about. But even if you were hand building, you know what I'm talking about. Clay is a membrane that you stretch with both hands, right? It's like the tension of the pressure of the inside and the pressure of the outside. So I was thinking that I've done what I could on this kind of like object scale, but I want to do it on a spatial scale, like on an architectural scale. So I went around and asked my computer science department at the University of Washington if somebody could help me developing a virtual reality space that actually is my sculpture, and you were inside of it and you were shaping it from the inside. And they were like, I don't know what you want. And they went down to very technical levels of asking me about it, and it's like, I don't know, I came to you to help, like tell me what's possible. Like, I don't know how this will be done. But so that's where we were 4 years ago. And then last year they said, like, you know what, we have this VR capstone, why don't you come into that? We have worked with a group of students, you mentor them, and then they will generate a project around your idea. And so the idea was that I did want to create a virtual space that is my sculpture, and you are inside of it, you shape it with your hands. And then, oh, sorry, I started the wrong video. No, not this, the other one. Never mind. Here. So in the first quarter of working on this, we didn't even get this far. But basically we tried to approach it so it was a virtual object that was described. See those little ping pong balls? By those little ping pong balls, those are just the markers that you can actually move, and then you would move them. But you also see that it's kind of like a jelly, that it kind of like has its own logic, it's not inert. And I really loved that. That was one of the things I really wanted to code into it, and we made it work. And then another, like 3-4 months later, we are inside of the thing now, and it's a pink blob, you're inside of it, and you get to push and pull on the walls. And then, so we worked quite a while, and Zoe, who was here earlier, who became my collaborator, helped me to actually bring this into shape, and then you're gonna see this later if you'd like to see it. You can get inside of this. This is one of the screenshots from the space. So now it does look like my sculptures. You were still inside. You can shape it, and if you'd like to, I can just tell you why everybody is here together. So you put on the goggles. You're inside of a space. Take a moment to orient yourself and not get dizzy. It's very disorienting. And then you can point towards the wall, and then it's going to be like a kind of like a laser shooting out of your finger, and will touch the wall. So go ahead and walk up to the wall, and then your finger is going to be right on the wall, and use your index finger, because that's what it recognizes, to shape it. Okay, so you can pinch, you can pull, you can push, you can do all that, and it will shape it. Great. And I don't know how, my apologies, for some reason I didn't acknowledge Zoe. So Zoe Caputo is my collaborator on the coding of this space, and that should be very clear on the slide, but yet it was kind of left off as I was doing that. So this is pretty much like there are many types of spaces. The shapes of the space are different, and the colors in the space are different, but the behavior of the space is all the same. And then what happens in the space, anytime of the moment you take a snapshot of the space by doing this. Okay, you will do this, you hear a click, and that means that the goggles are saving the shape of the space right at that moment. Okay, what becomes then something that I can take and I can print. So all the work that I have made here is originating by someone shaping one of the spaces. There are two, my favorites are this shaped space, and here are the different kind of like iterations, and it's like not being shaped too much, and it's like shaped too much, and then shape more. And then these are the porcelain pieces I made at home. They are about this big. I was just sort of getting into it, but I wanted to make them big, and that's why I came to be with you. But the perks of being here is that I get to make them really big. And what I wanted to say that this is a very unique facility. It's a very unique organization. It's been such a pleasure to meet you all. I think you have something very amazing with the Clay Studio of Santa Barbara. I see a wonderful community. I see that everybody is thriving, and you guys are really loving that place, which just brings me back to the days when I started in clay, and it wouldn't have been if it wasn't for like all of the love that was going into a shared studio. So thank you, Matt, Mitros, thank you, Barbara, Max, Jacob, Jolly, everybody, the staff who's been involved, and especially wanting to thank Joey, because one thing about this kind of equipment, that just like any tool that's in the world, you have to get to know the tool. It's not true for 3D printers that you push the button and it will make the stuff for you. It won't. And it's like there are many stories we can tell you about how, I mean, Daria has been here since yesterday, and you see me like running between printers every 10 minutes, just checking and making sure it's doing it, and like shaping, making up for it. But so, I mean, I want to thank Joey, because without Joey, I wouldn't have been able to do this at all, because these are not my tools. I know the two printers that I have at home. I know everything that they are going to do. But coming into other printers, I had to rely on your knowledge, and I wouldn't have been able to do it if you weren't here. That is just the truth, and then this is the same thing as with every other tool and instrument, that it's like some muscle skill, you know, like muscle memory translates from one tool to another, but you still need to get to know that tool to actually finesse the result, right? When you really want to make the pot you want to make, you really want to be sitting down to that potter's wheel that you always use, right? You want to have those trimming tools. You want to use those kind of tools you always use, and that's why I travel with my tools. But when I come into the space, I'm always humbled by like how much it becomes confusing to like, you know, try the Brutum, or like, you know, the same day printing on 5 different types of printers, and it's like, which one does stop if I push this button, and like which one is going to crash into my piece if I, you know, do this other thing. So you just kind of have to learn these things. And you will see these pieces later. Of course, this has been 3 weeks. You always get the ideas in the like final 3 days, right? It's like, okay. And the funny thing about this is, so I'm printing with colored porcelain here. And it's set up in the Bergstrom in a way that it's in the, so the Bergstrom is printing from 4 tubes. And the very first day I saw the Bergstrom, I told Joey, like, wouldn't that be fun to have like different colors in each, so that at that we can change the rates by which the colors are coming out, and you get color areas in different places, and then we're like, okay, and then we got busy with other things, and I was like, then on Monday I was like, we need to do the color, Joey, right? And so we did the color, we did two pieces. I love those pieces so much, mostly because they are porcelain. They have pinks and reds and lavenders and all that, and yeah, you will hopefully see them later. Okay, wait, maybe just two shout-outs. So this is my studio, Slip Rabbit. I have some cars that are also stickers in the space. We have done in the past 8 years, we have done a lot for kind of like education and mentoring and building communities. We have ceramicists, architects, designers, engineers regularly coming to our open houses, part of Women in 3D Printing, do all that stuff. And then in 2000, my book came out. It's an artist book. It is about a lot of what I talked about, minus the very personal stuff. It is about 3D printing in ceramics. It's about also mathematics, about codes and the hand. There are maybe like 4 copies left of this, and then the book is completely out. But it is available for free download if you go to the Slip Rabbit Studio website and you go to the book. Every chapter is a free download, so you can read it online or you can download it. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to thank you all for. So my understanding is that we have some snacks out there in the classroom space, and then once you got some snacks, we can do some Q&A here if you want to, or we can just kind of like carry the conversation to the snacks. And then maybe in a half hour, 12:30, I'm gonna start a walkthrough with you. So I would like to take you around so that I can show you and tell you what's what. And then we are gathering in the classroom space, and then we'll come around through the front desk into my little studio here, and then walk down the hall back into the warehouse where the bigger pieces are, and then you can try out the VR space there, and then we kind of finish there. So if you need to know how to get out of the warehouse space, just ask.